Eleanor Whitman's chalk stopped mid-stroke across the blackboard. Her weathered hand hovered in the air, trembling ever so slightly. A sudden gust of October wind burst through the cracked classroom window, ripping the corner of a bulletin board clean off and scattering construction paper leaves across the linoleum floor. The room, always a bit drafty in autumn, fell into an uncanny silence. 28 third graders stared in a frozen moment of collective disbelief. For the first time in their young lives, they saw their beloved teacher's entire face. Eleanor's silver hair, usually tucked just so to cover the left side of her face, now fluttered back from her cheek, exposing something none of them could have imagined: a swollen mass, the size of a clenched fist, bulging from her temple to her jawline. The tumor distorted her skin in lumpy waves of discolored flesh that seemed too surreal to be real. Tommy Morrison's juice box slipped from his fingers and hit the floor with a hollow thud. Its contents spread slowly, a red tide seeping outward like a spilled secret. Emma Rodriguez let out a soft, breathless "oh" before covering her mouth with both hands, her eyes, wide and shimmering, locked on the woman who, just minutes ago, had been making them laugh with funny voices during a story about a talking pumpkin. The fluorescent lights hummed louder than usual, or maybe that was just Eleanor's pulse pounding in her ears. She froze, eyes scanning the room, heart racing as she realized what had happened. Her left hand shot up to her head, fingers fumbling to pull her hair back into place. But it was too late. The damage was done. 40 years of carefully constructed angles and layers of concealer had been undone in 3 seconds of cruel wind. From the back of the room came the unmistakable clatter of a wrench hitting the radiator. Bob Martinez, the school's longtime maintenance worker, had dropped his tool when he caught sight of her face. Mrs. Patterson, a parent standing in the doorway for early pickup, took a step backward, eyes wide. Then, like a blade through the hush, Tommy's voice broke the silence. "Does it hurt, Mrs. Whitman?" he asked. His voice soft, filled not with fear, but something closer to concern. Eleanor couldn't answer. Her throat closed. Her legs moved before her brain could think. She turned, almost stumbling, and walked quickly toward the supply closet at the back of the classroom. She opened the door, stepped inside, and shut it behind her, pressing her back against the cool metal shelving as if trying to vanish into the wall. Outside, the classroom remained silent. 28 children sat still, the remnants of art supplies and storybooks forgotten. The sound of the wind whistling through the broken window filled the void where their teacher's voice used to be. The door to Eleanor Whitman's apartment creaked as she pushed it open with a trembling hand. She stepped inside without turning on the light. The late afternoon sun filtered in through the dusty blinds, casting long slats of gold across the faded rug. She closed the door softly behind her and stood still for a moment, her back pressed against the wood, breathing shallowly. Her apartment, perched above Henderson's hardware store, smelled faintly of old paper and lemon disinfectant. Everything had a place, the shoes tucked neatly beneath the bench, the stack of bills clipped in order on the kitchen counter, the tea kettle aligned perfectly with the stove burner. It was the home of someone who needed control, who clung to routine like a raft in a storm. She walked toward the bathroom, her hand grazing the hallway wall to steady herself. The mirror was covered by a navy blue hand towel, as it had been for years. She stood in front of it, staring at the cloth like it might start speaking. Her fingers reached up and slowly lifted one corner, and there it was. The tumor bulged beneath the skin like a grotesque second face, pressing outward from her temple, swelling her cheek and jaw. The discoloration had darkened over the years, now tinged with bruised purple and angry red where the skin thinned. The flesh around her left eye drooped, making the eye itself appear half-closed, tired even when she wasn't. She dropped the towel back over the mirror. Eleanor sat down on the closed lid of the toilet and buried her face in her hands. Shame wasn't a sharp feeling anymore. It had become a dull ache, familiar and persistent, like arthritis in her bones. But today had reopened a wound she thought she'd long since buried. She could still see the way Emma's mouth had fallen open, the way the room had gone quiet, not the silence of attention, but the silence of shock. She hated that she had seen their faces. Not because they were cruel, no, not these children, but because they were honest. Children were always honest, and that made their shock harder to bear than any adult's judgment. Her mind drifted, uninvited, to the night that changed everything. It had rained that evening in 1987, hard enough that her wipers could barely keep up. She was 27, fresh out of teacher's college, her certification papers still warm in her briefcase. George was beside her in the passenger seat, laughing about something trivial, the kind of laugh that turned ordinary moments into gold. They were coming back from a dinner party, their first as a married couple. She remembered the dress she wore, green silk, with a little brooch shaped like a hummingbird. George had picked it out. The headlights came out of nowhere. A blinding flash, the crunch of metal on metal. Screaming, hers, maybe his, she couldn't remember. The windshield shattered inward, spraying them with glass. She remembered the pain in her face, the warm wetness, and George calling her name over and over again. She woke up 2 days later. George had survived with minor injuries. She had not been so lucky. The initial diagnosis was optimistic. Just surface trauma, they said. But within weeks, a small swelling developed on the left side of her face. At first it was mistaken for scar tissue, then inflammation, then something else. Surgeries followed, 3 in total, but nothing stopped the growth. It returned slowly, then rapidly. A specialist in Columbus called it inoperable. Another called it a chronic mass of undetermined cause. Over time it simply became a part of her. By the time she was 30, it had reshaped her face. By 32, she had begun hiding it. Strategic hairstyles, scarves, heavy makeup, always sitting so her right profile faced outward, always adjusting the classroom lighting. By 35, she no longer appeared in family photos. Sarah had been a teenager then. Sarah. Eleanor opened her eyes and looked toward the cordless phone sitting on the bathroom sink. She hadn't spoken to her daughter in nearly 15 years. The last phone call had ended in silence. Sarah had accused her of choosing shame over connection, of letting the tumor define their lives. "You chose to disappear, Mom," Sarah had said. Eleanor hadn't known how to answer, so she hadn't. Now the classroom door had swung wide open. The secret had been seen. Her face, the one she had hidden from the world, had stared into the eyes of 28 children she loved. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in a very long time, she felt something deeper than fear. She felt exposed. The classroom was silent, but not empty. Eleanor could hear the faint creak of chairs, the sound of little shoes shifting against the floor. Through the narrow crack beneath the supply closet door, she saw their shadows moving, small, tentative, uncertain. Inside the cramped space, she sat slumped against a shelf stacked with construction paper and plastic bins of paintbrushes. Her heart was still racing. Her hands, clasped in her lap, trembled as if echoing the wind that had exposed her. The air smelled of glue and old paper, oddly comforting. She drew her knees closer to her chest, trying to become smaller, trying to disappear. She had imagined this moment hundreds of times. What would happen if someone saw her? Not just a glimpse, but really saw her. She always imagined shame, disgust, maybe even screams. She never once imagined silence. And yet, here they were, quiet. Not because they didn't care, but because they didn't know what to do. Then came the voice, the same small voice from before. "Mrs. Whitman?" It was Tommy. Of course it was Tommy. She could picture him, freckles, cowlick, eyes too big for his face. He had been her student since first grade, retained due to reading delays. She had worked with him for years. He always sat up front, always smiled when she praised his progress. "Are you okay?" he asked. She couldn't answer. Her throat felt thick with emotion, her mouth dry as chalk dust. "I'm sorry if we made you sad," he continued. There was a pause, then another voice, Emma's. "You don't have to hide from us," she said softly. A third voice chimed in. "Marcus Thompson, we still like you. You're still our teacher." Eleanor closed her eyes. A lump rose in her throat, sharper than the pain in her face. They weren't screaming. They weren't mocking. They were waiting for her. She could hear little footsteps now, more of them. They were gathering just outside the door. The noise was soft, like leaves rustling. They weren't afraid of her. They were trying to reach her. She pressed her palm to the tumor on her cheek. The skin was warm and aching, the pressure increasing with every beat of her heart. Her hair hung down over her face again, and for once she didn't push it aside. She didn't need to anymore. They had already seen what was underneath. She looked at the closed door. A long breath escaped her lips, the kind that comes after holding something inside for too long. Outside, Tommy knocked again. Just once. "We made you something," he said. But you don't have to come out if you don't want to. We'll wait. Eleanor covered her mouth with one hand and stifled a sob. The voices on the other side of the door weren't adult voices laced with judgment. They were pure, small, uncertain, but steady. They reminded her of the stories she used to read to them, about dragons, misfits, and heroes who were scared but brave anyway. A small paper heart slid under the door. She stared at it. Crayon scribbles read, "We love you, Mrs. Whitman." Her fingers hovered above it, trembling. Then slowly she picked it up, pressed it to her chest and wept, not from shame, but from something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Hope. Karen Beaumont adjusted her sunglasses with one manicured hand as she marched toward the front office of Millfield Elementary, the heels of her boots tapping sharply against the linoleum floor. She wasn't normally the type to involve herself directly in school matters. Fundraisers, yes. PTA elections, absolutely. But today? Today called for immediate action. She had been standing in the hallway, waiting to pick up her daughter Brittany early for a dentist appointment, when she saw it. The face. That face. Brittany had squeezed her hand afterward, eyes wide with something between fear and confusion. "Mommy," she had whispered. "What's wrong with her face?" Now Karen pushed through the office door and approached the front desk, where Principal Janet Morrison was speaking quietly with the secretary. The principal looked up as Karen entered, face polite but tired. "Mrs. Beaumont," Janet said calmly, "we weren't expecting you back today." Karen pulled off her sunglasses and tucked them into her handbag with controlled irritation. "I need to speak with you. Privately." Janet gestured toward her office, motioning for the secretary to hold calls. Once inside, Karen wasted no time. "Janet, I saw it. Her face, I always suspected there was something strange going on with Mrs. Whitman, but this is unacceptable." Janet folded her hands on her desk, keeping her voice measured. "Mrs. Whitman has a medical condition. It doesn't affect her teaching." Karen's voice rose slightly. "You don't know that. My daughter had nightmares last night." "Nightmares? And she's not the only one. I've already spoken to 3 other parents whose children came home shaken." "Shaken," Janet repeated. "Shaken," Karen confirmed. "These are children, Janet, 8-year-olds. They're too young to process that kind of disfigurement. Honestly, I'm surprised the school allowed someone with such a visible condition to teach in the first place." Janet sat up straighter. "Eleanor Whitman has been a dedicated educator for over 40 years. She's beloved by students and staff alike. Her personal health matters have never interfered with her performance." Karen leaned in, her tone shifting from concerned mother to calculating strategist. "Maybe not until now, but yesterday, that changed everything. You know how fast word spreads in this town. Parents are going to start asking questions, hard ones. If you don't address this, the district will." Janet inhaled slowly. "What exactly are you suggesting?" "I'm starting a petition," Karen said flatly, "requesting that Mrs. Whitman take a leave of absence until further notice, until something is done about her condition." "She's not contagious," Janet said sharply. "This isn't a disease that can be spread." "I know that," Karen snapped. "I'm not a monster. But this isn't about germs, it's about what's appropriate for an educational environment. Appearance matters, Janet. You can't deny that." Janet leaned back in her chair, silent for a moment. "And what about what's appropriate in terms of compassion?" she asked. "What are we teaching our kids if we remove someone simply because she looks different?" Karen didn't blink. "We're teaching them boundaries. We're teaching them that it's okay to feel uncomfortable when something isn't normal." There was a knock on the door before either of them could continue. The secretary poked her head in. "There's a reporter on the line from the Millfield Herald," she said, eyes flicking between the 2 women. "They're asking about the incident yesterday." Janet sighed, already feeling the weight of a long week beginning to press down. Karen stood up, smoothing her skirt. "I'm just saying," she said as she turned to leave, "you might want to get ahead of this before the story writes itself." Janet remained in her chair after the door closed, her gaze lingering on the petition form Karen had left behind, already half filled with names. The battle lines were being drawn. The wind howled outside her apartment like a chorus of ghosts as Eleanor Whitman sat curled in the armchair by the window, wrapped in her thickest shawl. The light from the lamp cast a warm circle around her, but she felt none of its comfort. The rest of the apartment was cloaked in shadow. Her teacup sat untouched on the table beside her, growing colder by the minute. Her head throbbed. A low pulsing ache had been building behind her left eye for weeks, but now it was almost unbearable. She closed her good eye and leaned her head back, pressing her fingers to her temple. A warm, wet sensation met her touch. When she pulled her hand away, there was blood on her fingertips. Again, she stood slowly and walked to the bathroom, her legs unsteady. The towel still covered the mirror. She didn't move it this time. She didn't need to. She knew what she looked like. Worse now, she knew what others saw too. She rinsed her hand under cold water, pressing a clean towel to her cheek where the tumor had begun to bleed. It had started happening more often, first once a month, then once a week. Now it was nearly every day. She'd scheduled a doctor's appointment for the following week, but even that had taken courage. She dreaded hearing what she already suspected, that time was running out. Returning to the chair, she sat down slowly and picked up a piece of folded paper from the table. A child's drawing, a crayon heart. "We love you, Mrs. Whitman." Tommy had slipped it under the closet door. The edges were smudged where she'd held it too tightly. She looked at it for a long time, her mind drifting to darker places. What was the point? 3 more months. That's all she had planned to endure. Just 3 more months until her long-awaited retirement. She'd imagined slipping away quietly, without fuss, without anyone ever knowing the truth, maybe even moving somewhere far away, to a little cabin, or a coastal town where no one knew her name, somewhere she could disappear. But now the illusion was shattered. She could still see their faces, wide-eyed, startled, unsure, not cruel but honest in the way only children could be. It wasn't their fault. They hadn't meant to hurt her, but their eyes had confirmed what she'd feared for decades, that her face, her disfigurement, was too much. She reached under the chair cushion and pulled out a small wooden box. Inside it was a worn, unopened envelope. The check, $2 million, dated October 9th, 1987. She had refused it back then, insisting the accident had been her fault. The insurance company hadn't argued. No one had. She'd carried the guilt like a second skin for nearly 4 decades, punishing herself by living quietly, by never spending money she didn't earn, by turning down any help offered. Now the paper had yellowed with age, the ink fading at the edges. It wasn't even valid anymore, just a symbol of a life she'd rejected. Eleanor held it in her lap and stared at it, her thoughts thick and slow. The pain in her head returned, stronger this time. Her vision in the left eye blurred again. She closed both eyes and let the darkness come. And then the phone rang. She didn't move at first. It rang again, then a third time. She sighed, reached over, and picked up the receiver. "Hello?" Her voice was barely a whisper, a pause, then a breath on the other end, and then a voice she hadn't heard in 15 years. "Mom?" Eleanor froze. Her heart skipped. She didn't know if she was dreaming, hallucinating, or dying. "Sarah?" "Yes." The voice broke slightly. "It's me." Silence stretched between them. "I saw the story," Sarah said. "Someone sent me a link. I didn't believe it at first, but then I saw your picture." Eleanor swallowed. "You saw—" "I saw everything," Sarah interrupted gently. "And I'm so sorry, Mom, for leaving, for being ashamed, for everything." Eleanor's throat closed. "No, you had every right." "No, I didn't," Sarah said, firmer now. "You were hurting and I left you alone in it. That was my failure, not yours." Eleanor clutched the receiver tighter. "I have children now," Sarah continued. "Michael and Isabella. They're 9 and 12. I never told them much about you. I didn't know how. But now I realize I was wrong." Eleanor's lips trembled. "You don't have to say this." "I do," Sarah said. "Because I'm getting on a plane. Tonight. We're coming to see you." Eleanor blinked rapidly, trying to make sense of the words. "We?" she echoed. "Yes, all 3 of us. Mom, they need to meet their grandmother. And I need to see you again, really see you." Eleanor couldn't speak. Her voice had vanished somewhere between the beating of her heart and the flood of tears rising behind her eyes. "I love you," Sarah said softly. "We're coming home." The line clicked and the silence returned. Eleanor set the receiver down slowly. Her hands were still shaking, but not from fear this time, from something else. She looked down at the check one more time, then at the crayon heart on the table. She didn't know what the next day would bring, or whether she'd even make it to her doctor's appointment. But for the first time in years, the thought of tomorrow didn't feel like a punishment. It felt like a promise. Tommy Morrison sat cross-legged on the living room carpet, surrounded by markers, glitter glue, and construction paper. His tongue stuck out slightly as he focused on tracing bold block letters across a bright yellow poster. At the top, In red crayon he had written, "We love Mrs. Whitman." Underneath he drew a stick figure with silver hair, arms outstretched, surrounded by smiling children. Lisa Morrison peeked around the doorway, holding a plate of cookies. "How's the protest coming?" she asked gently. Tommy looked up, his expression serious beyond his 8 years. "It's not a protest, Mom. It's a mission. Operation Mrs. Whitman." Lisa smiled and set the cookies down beside him. "Right, of course." Tommy returned to his work, gluing a cut-out heart next to the stick figure. He'd spent the afternoon calling his classmates, well, their moms, and explaining the plan. They would all bring signs tomorrow. No one would do math or reading or spelling until Mrs. Whitman came back. "Do you think she's okay?" he asked suddenly, not looking up. Lisa hesitated. "I don't know, honey, but I know she's very lucky to have you caring so much." Tommy frowned. "She always stays late to help us. Even when I was in first grade and couldn't read the word elephant, she said it was okay. She said I'd get it someday." He looked at his mother. "I did, you know." "I know," Lisa said, kneeling beside him. "She helped you believe you could." Tommy nodded solemnly, then added one more word to the bottom of the poster: hope. The next morning, the school hallway buzzed with nervous excitement. Students whispered in corners, exchanged rolled-up signs, and made pinky promises to stay strong. At 8:15 sharp, Tommy walked into room 203 with his sign held high. Mrs. Patterson, the substitute teacher, stood at the front with a stack of worksheets and a face like cold toast. "Good morning, class," she said, looking over her glasses. "Please take your seats and prepare for silent reading." No one moved. Tommy stood in the center aisle and turned slowly to face the class. One by one, the students pulled out their own signs and held them up. "We miss you, Mrs. Whitman. Different is beautiful. Bring back our teacher." Mrs. Patterson blinked. "We're not doing anything until she comes back," Tommy said clearly. "That's our decision." The substitute's mouth opened and closed like a confused fish. "Young man, this isn't how we behave in a learning environment." Emma Rodriguez raised her hand. "It's exactly how we behave when someone we love is being treated unfairly." Marcus Thompson chimed in. "She didn't do anything wrong. People just got scared of her face." Mrs. Patterson glanced at the hallway, clearly unsure whether to get help or just walk out. Meanwhile, the children remained still but determined, their signs resting proudly on their desks. Outside the classroom, whispers turned to murmurs. A second-grade teacher peeked in, then quickly retreated, phone in hand. Within minutes, the front office knew, the principal knew, the whole building knew. In room 203, the children sat tall and quiet, united not in defiance but in love. Their message wasn't complicated. It didn't need to be. Mrs. Whitman wasn't just their teacher, she was their hero. Principal Janet Morrison rubbed her temples as she listened to the 5th phone call of the morning. Outside her office window, the school courtyard buzzed with activity, not the usual recess chatter, but clusters of parents talking in hushed tones, teachers checking their phones, and the occasional flash of a news van pulling up near the staff parking lot. "Yes, Mrs. Armstrong," Janet said into the phone, her voice strained but polite. "I understand your concerns. Yes, I assure you we're doing everything we can to maintain a safe and inclusive environment for your children." She ended the call, took a breath, and immediately the phone rang again. Janet didn't answer this time. She stood up and walked to the window, watching the ripple effect that had started in room 203 and now spread like wildfire through Millfield Elementary. What began as a quiet, symbolic act of loyalty had turned into a full-blown movement. By mid-morning, not just Tommy's class but 4 other classrooms had joined the sit-in. Students sat quietly at their desks holding handmade signs. Some had taped them to the front of their desks, others simply held them in their laps, eyes forward, faces solemn. Parents were beginning to gather at the front office. Some had come to show support, others demanded explanations, and then there were the reporters. Janet turned from the window and saw Mrs. Patterson, still flustered from her morning with the 3rd graders, standing in the doorway, clutching a file folder to her chest. "They're refusing to do anything," Patterson said, her voice tight with frustration. "They won't open their books. They won't speak unless it's about Mrs. Whitman. One child even told me I should go back to college and learn about empathy." Janet tried not to smile. "That sounds like Tommy." "It was Emma, actually," Patterson replied stiffly. Janet exhaled slowly. "Thank you, Mrs. Patterson. I'll handle it from here." As the substitute left, Janet's secretary popped her head in. "You have visitors," she said cautiously. "Parents? 3. And a reporter from the Millfield Herald. And there's a news crew from Columbus setting up in the parking lot. Janet pinched the bridge of her nose. Perfect. She stepped into the hallway just as Karen Beaumont rounded the corner, flanked by two other sharply dressed mothers. Karen's heels clicked purposefully, and she carried a manila folder tucked under one arm. "I warned you this would happen," Karen said without waiting for pleasantries. "Now it's spiraling out of control." Janet held up a hand. "Let's take this to my office." Inside, Karen opened the folder and laid a stack of documents on the desk. "Petition signatures," she said. 47 and counting. "We believe Mrs. Whitman's presence is disrupting the learning environment. Children are being emotionally manipulated. This sit-in is proof of that." Janet flipped through the pages, her face unreadable. She recognized many of the names. A few surprised her. Others, not at all. "Have you seen the other petition?" Janet asked calmly. Karen blinked. "What petition?" Janet reached into her own desk drawer and pulled out a crumpled sheet of paper with colorful signatures, stickers, and glitter ink. At the top it read, "Please let Mrs. Whitman stay forever." Karen's mouth twitched. Janet set the page aside. "Look, I understand this is complicated. I truly do. But this woman has given her entire life to this school. She's taught hundreds, maybe thousands of students. Including your brother, if I'm not mistaken." Karen looked away. "I'm not saying we ignore the concerns," Janet continued. "But we need to think carefully before we decide what message we're sending. To the kids. To the town. To everyone watching." Karen's eyes narrowed. "Everyone is watching. And if we don't act, the district will. The superintendent is already getting calls." Janet didn't respond. She simply looked out the window again, where the news vans had multiplied. The battle was no longer inside the school. It was public now. The Millfield Elementary Auditorium had never held this many people. Normally a space for spring recitals and fifth-grade spelling bees, tonight it looked and felt like a courtroom. Rows upon rows of parents, teachers, students, alumni, and curious townsfolk packed into the modest hall. Cameras lined the back wall, their red lights glowing like watchful eyes. At the front of the stage, the 5 school board members sat behind a long table, their expressions tense and neutral. Superintendent Martha Caldwell sat at the center like a judge, lips pressed thin, watching as people filtered in. On the left side of the auditorium sat Karen Beaumont and her allies, their rows neat and hushed. On the right, a vibrant array of students and parents holding handmade signs. "Let her teach, Mrs. Whitman, help me read. Kindness is not scary." In the front row sat Tommy Morrison, clutching a rolled-up poster and sitting so straight he looked twice his age. At 7:05 p.m., Board Chair Robert Hayes stood and tapped the microphone. "Thank you all for coming to this emergency session of the Millfield School Board. We're here to discuss the situation surrounding Mrs. Eleanor Whitman, a third-grade teacher at this school." There was a subtle shift in the air at the mention of her name. Something reverent, something electric. "We'll hear statements from concerned parties," Hayes continued. "We ask for civility and brevity." Karen Beaumont stood immediately. She wore a sleek navy dress, hair perfectly arranged, and the same manila folder clutched like a shield. She walked to the microphone, heels clicking with certainty. "Board members, parents, members of the media, this is not a personal attack," Karen began. "This is about what's appropriate in an educational setting." She paused dramatically. "My daughter, along with dozens of others, has been subjected to distressing visuals in the classroom. As parents, we have a duty to protect our children from trauma, even unintentional. I have here 47 signatures from parents demanding Mrs. Whitman's immediate resignation." She lifted the folder, then gently placed it on the table. "This is not about discrimination," Karen said smoothly. "It's about age-appropriate environments. Children are not emotionally equipped to process such visible deformities. Some have had nightmares. Others are asking questions far beyond their emotional maturity." A quiet murmur of disagreement stirred in the opposing section, but Karen pressed on. "This is not about whether Mrs. Whitman is kind. I'm sure she is. But our duty is to our children's well-being. And it is clear that her presence, through no fault of her own, has become a distraction." She gave a final nod and stepped down, returning to her seat with an air of triumph. A long silence followed. Then, from the far aisle, Tommy Morrison stood up. Heads turned as the small boy made his way to the microphone. His mother reached for his arm, but he shook his head gently and walked on. He stood at the podium, barely tall enough to see over it. "My name is Tommy Morrison," he said. His voice wavered for a moment, then steadied. "And Mrs. Whitman is my teacher." The audience was still waiting. "Mrs. Whitman has been my teacher for 3 years. She's funny. She makes voices when she reads us books. She never forgets our birthdays. She buys extra crayons with her own money when kids don't have supplies." He glanced at the school board, then looked directly at Karen Beaumont. "She looks different now. That's true, but that doesn't make her scary. It makes her strong." Karen shifted in her seat. "Some kids had questions, sure. But questions aren't bad. Mrs. Whitman said once that questions are how we learn." He took a deep breath. "If you take her away from us, you're teaching us that being different is bad, that kindness doesn't matter, that what's on your face is more important than what's in your heart." Tommy unrolled the poster in his hand. Crayon letters in bright colors read, "Mrs. Whitman is beautiful because she never gives up." He held it high for everyone to see. The room was dead quiet for 3 full seconds. Then the clapping began, first from a single parent, then a teacher, then from nearly the entire right side of the auditorium. A wave of applause rolled forward, crashing over the silence like a thunderclap of truth. But then something happened that stopped even the applause. The auditorium doors opened slowly, and a hush fell over the room. Eleanor Whitman entered. She walked alone, slowly but with purpose. She wore a plain navy dress and held her head high. For the first time in 40 years, her face was uncovered. The tumor that had once been concealed behind makeup and hair now stretched from temple to jaw, stitched and raw from recent bleeding, but exposed without shame. Some gasped, others turned away, but many simply stared with wide, aching eyes at the bravery, the raw humanity, the defiance in her stride. Eleanor walked down the center aisle, past the stunned crowd, and stopped at the microphone. She looked out at the audience, then up at the board. "My name is Eleanor Whitman," she said, "and I think it's time I told you my story." Eleanor stood at the microphone, facing hundreds of eyes, each watching with a mix of awe, discomfort, guilt, and reverence. For the first time in her adult life, she wasn't hiding behind her hair, her makeup, or a wall of shame. Her tumor, raw and swollen, visible under the fluorescent lights, made no apologies. "My name," she said, her voice surprisingly clear, "is Eleanor Whitman. And I have been a teacher at Millfield Elementary for over 40 years. There was no preamble, no jokes, no softening, just truth. I've spent most of those years hiding, not just from the world, but from myself." The room was silent, not a rustle, not a whisper. Even the cameramen had stopped fidgeting. "When I was 27 years old, I was in a car accident. It left me with injuries that later turned into what you see on my face today. Back then, I refused a settlement. I thought it was my fault. I believed I didn't deserve anything, that I deserved to live in shame." She paused, her eyes sweeping across the crowd. "And I did. For decades, I never meant to scare anyone, least of all children. I love children. I chose this career because I believed that helping a child learn to read, to think, to feel safe in a classroom was the most sacred kind of work a person could do." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small tissue, dabbing at the corner of her mouth, where blood was beginning to bead again. The audience stirred slightly, but Eleanor didn't flinch. "I've heard the argument that my appearance is traumatizing to students, that my condition might cause nightmares, discomfort, or confusion." She took a slow breath and for a moment her voice wavered. "But do you know what really traumatizes children? Being made to believe that kindness isn't enough, that if you look a certain way, you're not worthy of love, of work, of dignity." Karen Beaumont sat still, her lips pressed together, eyes lowered. "I was going to resign tonight," Eleanor admitted, her voice dropping. "I didn't want to be a burden. I thought that if I quietly stepped away, all of this would fade and people would be comfortable again." She looked down at Tommy Morrison, who sat in the front row, still holding his crayon-colored sign like a flag. "But then a little boy reminded me why I stayed all these years. He said I was beautiful, not because of how I looked, but because I never gave up." Her voice cracked then, not from nerves, but from emotion long buried. "I hid my face because I thought it made people uncomfortable, but maybe the thing that should make us uncomfortable is how quickly we judge what we don't understand." She wiped her lips again. The blood was now visibly staining the tissue. "I didn't choose this face, but I did choose how I lived with it, And for 40 years I chose service, compassion, patience, and love. A few tears rolled silently down cheeks in the audience. You may choose to remove me from the classroom, she said, looking directly at the board. That is your right, but I will not resign in shame. I am not ashamed anymore. She took a trembling breath. I am not a monster. I'm a teacher. I am a human being, and I am finally not afraid to be seen. A moment of stunned silence followed. Then a ripple of applause began, from the students, from the parents, from staff and alumni who had come to support her. It grew into a standing ovation that shook the auditorium. Eleanor stepped back from the podium, her lips parted slightly, as if stunned by the wave of warmth rising toward her. The love she had run from for decades now stood all around her, clapping and cheering, and this time she didn't shrink from it. But then something shifted. Her eyes blinked rapidly. Her balance faltered. She took a step backward. A thin trail of blood trickled down her cheek, catching the harsh stage light like a scarlet thread. Eleanor? Principal Janet Morrison had stood halfway up from her seat. Eleanor's hand reached for the podium, but her fingers slipped. Her knees gave way. Gasps erupted from the crowd as she crumpled to the floor. Mrs. Whitman, Tommy shouted, rushing forward. Chaos followed. Teachers darted toward the stage. Principal Morrison sprinted up the steps. Parents stood frozen in their rows, unsure whether to approach or make space. Call an ambulance, someone shouted. She's bleeding again. Paramedics, who had been stationed in the hallway due to the nature of the meeting and her known condition, arrived in less than 2 minutes. Eleanor lay on her side, barely conscious, her breathing shallow. Pulses dropping, a medic said, checking her vitals. We need to move her now. Tommy stood near the edge of the stage, fists clenched at his sides, eyes wide and wet. His poster had fallen to the floor, crumpled under someone's foot. As they lifted her onto the stretcher, Eleanor's eyes fluttered open. She looked toward Tommy. Her lips moved faintly. You're brave, she whispered. Then her head fell back. The paramedics rushed her out of the building. The auditorium, once filled with celebration and noise, was now silent once more. No one moved. Not the board, not the parents. Not even Karen Beaumont, whose carefully composed expression had collapsed into something softer, something shaken. In that instant, the debate was over. It was no longer about appearances, or comfort, or what was deemed age-appropriate. It was about whether a community had failed someone who had given her entire life to it. And for once, Millfield Elementary was completely, painfully awake. The sterile white lights of the ICU buzzed faintly overhead as Eleanor Whitman lay unconscious in a hospital bed, her face partially wrapped in gauze. Machines beeped softly at her bedside, steady but uncertain. A plastic tube delivered oxygen through her nose. A nurse adjusted the IV drip as Dr. Patel read her chart silently, brow furrowed. She had a cranial bleed, likely due to the tumor pressing against a major artery, he murmured to the nurse. We stopped the worst of it, but the mass is progressing faster than we thought. She needs surgery. Soon. Will she wake up? The nurse asked gently. Dr. Patel hesitated. We hope so. Outside the room, Principal Janet Morrison sat in a plastic chair with her arms folded tightly across her chest, watching Eleanor through the glass window. Her usual professionalism had faded, replaced by something raw, guilt perhaps, or shame. Sarah stood beside her, holding a cup of vending machine coffee that had gone cold hours ago. Her eyes were red from crying. I should have come back sooner, Sarah whispered. I should have made her see the doctor years ago. Janet shook her head. She wouldn't let anyone in. Sarah, you know how she was stubborn, Sarah muttered. Always more worried about others than herself. They both fell silent as a nurse walked by, nodding politely. Back in Millfield, word of the incident at the school board meeting had spread like wildfire. A video, shot on a parent's phone, captured everything. Eleanor's speech, Tommy's poster, the collapse. Within 24 hours, it had been viewed over 3 million times. The hashtags #LetHerTeach and #EleanorWhitman began trending across social media platforms. It wasn't just locals anymore. News anchors in Chicago, Boston, even Los Angeles were running segments titled, The Teacher Who Refused to Hide. Late that night, a former student named Maya Reeves, now a freelance graphic designer in New York, posted a thread on Twitter. Mrs. Whitman taught me how to write my first essay. She stayed after school 3 days a week until I passed reading comprehension. I have dyslexia. She never made me feel dumb. She made me feel seen. She saved my life in ways I can't explain. If she needs help now, I'm all in. #LetHerTeach, #EleanorWhitman. Maya's post went viral. In response, she launched a GoFundMe campaign titled, "Help Eleanor Get the Surgery She Deserves." Within the first 12 hours, it raised over $45,000. Stories began pouring in from all over. A local firefighter who couldn't read until 3rd grade. She sat with me at lunch every day for a year. A woman from Texas. I never met her, but I showed my kids her speech. We cried together. A mother of a child with facial deformities. Thank you for showing my son that he is not alone. The town of Millfield, so used to its sleepy routine, suddenly found itself at the center of a national conversation. At Joe's Diner, the usual morning coffee crowd was quieter than usual. The waitress, Cheryl, slipped a small envelope into the tip jar labeled for Mrs. Whitman. No one questioned it. At Millfield Elementary, students were still writing letters, drawing pictures, making banners. One class organized a bake sale to raise funds for Mrs. W's healing cookies. Even teachers who had once expressed quiet doubts now spoke differently in the lounge. She never missed a day unless she was bleeding, one whispered. I never knew how bad it really was. Meanwhile, back in the hospital, Eleanor stirred. It was just a flutter of fingers at first, then her eyelids twitched. Sarah gasped. Mom? She whispered, leaning closer. Eleanor's eyes opened slowly, glassy but present. She blinked against the light, then looked to her daughter, her voice a ragged whisper. You're here. Sarah nodded quickly, tears falling. Of course I'm here. Eleanor's eyes drifted to Janet outside the window. The kids? They're okay, Sarah assured her. They're fighting for you, all of them. Eleanor tried to smile, but her body wouldn't let her. A tear slipped down her cheek. I didn't think anyone would care, she said softly. Sarah took her hand. You were wrong. Eleanor closed her eyes again, exhausted. But this time she wasn't hiding. This time, she was resting in the knowledge that she wasn't alone. The following Saturday dawned cool and gold-tinted, the kind of autumn morning that felt like it had been painted rather than born. Maple leaves dusted the sidewalks of Millfield in soft crimson, and the air carried the scent of distant chimney smoke. But today wasn't just another fall day. Not in Millfield. Today was Eleanor Day. At Millfield Elementary, banners hung from the building's facade. Strings of handmade paper hearts lined the windows, each one bearing a name and a message. Thank you, Mrs. Whitman. You helped me believe in myself. You taught me how to be kind. You saved me. The idea had come from Tommy Morrison, of course. When his mother had asked him what he wanted for his birthday, he'd said without hesitation, a day just for Mrs. Whitman, so she knows how much we love her. Principal Janet Morrison had coordinated with the school board and parents. Yes, even Karen Beaumont, who had now become one of the most vocal supporters of Eleanor's recovery. Together, they had organized a town-wide celebration of the woman who, for decades, had shaped the lives of their children with quiet strength. But no one had expected what happened next. By 9 a.m., the front lawn of Millfield Elementary was filled not just with current students, but with hundreds of former students who had driven, flown, or hitchhiked in from all over the country. They came with their children, spouses, and framed class photos. They came holding signs, letters, and gifts. But most of all, they came with stories. Maya Reeves was there, fresh off a red-eye flight from New York. She held a sketchbook filled with portraits she'd drawn of her 3rd grade class. She was the first person to call me an artist, she told the local news crew. I believed her. That's why I kept going. Jared Thomas, now a firefighter in Chicago, brought a helmet inscribed with his name and department. She taught me how to read fire safety brochures when I couldn't even spell my last name. I owe her everything. Even Mike Chen, head of reconstructive surgery at the Cleveland Clinic, and Eleanor's former student, was there, though he would return to the hospital later that afternoon to check on his patient. I'm here today not as her doctor, he said, but as a little boy who used to stutter and couldn't look anyone in the eye, until she taught me that my voice mattered. A stage had been set up on the front lawn. Children took turns reading poems and sharing letters. A chorus of 3rd graders sang a song titled Beautiful Heart, written just for Eleanor. As they reached the chorus, you taught us how to shine, in your gentle, quiet way, and now we're here to tell you, it's your turn for love today. The crowd erupted into quiet tears and soft applause. Inside the hospital room, Eleanor sat upright in bed, surrounded by cards and sunflowers. The surgery had been a success, but her face was still healing. The swelling had reduced significantly, revealing the early signs of what would be a remarkably restored profile. Her cheekbones had returned. Her left eye had full movement again, and for the first time in nearly 40 years, she could look at herself in a mirror without flinching. Sarah was helping her adjust the laptop camera. The hospital had arranged a live stream so she could watch Eleanor Day from her room. Isabella and Michael sat at her side, gently explaining what each sign and banner meant. "Is that Jared?" Eleanor murmured, squinting at the screen. "Yes," Sarah confirmed. "And that's Maya. She flew in from New York." Eleanor looked bewildered. "All of them? For me?" Sarah nodded. "For you, Mom." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. "I thought I'd been forgotten." "No one forgets someone who changed their life," Sarah said. "They just wait for the right moment to say thank you." Back on the school lawn, the crowd grew quiet as Principal Morrison took the stage. "Millfield Elementary is proud to dedicate this day to a woman whose name is etched into the soul of our community," she began, voice catching. Eleanor Whitman didn't just teach reading and math. She taught empathy, courage, and resilience. She taught us how to look beyond the surface. And now the world is looking back and finally seeing her. The applause was deafening. Then Tommy Morrison stepped up to the microphone, wearing his cleanest shirt and carrying a large envelope. "I made something for Mrs. Whitman," he said shyly. "But it's not just from me." He opened the envelope and held up a certificate made from poster board, covered in crayon drawings and colorful signatures. It read, "Honorary Principle of Kindness, presented to Eleanor Whitman for 40 years of service to the hearts of children." Tommy smiled. "She always made us feel smart, even when we weren't, and brave, even when we were scared. And now I want her to know that even if her face changed, her heart never did. That's the part we love the most." Eleanor, watching from the hospital, was sobbing quietly, her hand clutched to her chest. Later that day, she received a call from the school board. "Eleanor," the chairman said warmly, "we're not just reinstating you, we're offering you the position of district mentor. We want you to help train the next generation of teachers. Not just how to teach, but how to care." Eleanor paused for a long time before responding. "I'd be honored," she whispered. As the sun began to dip behind the trees and the crowd slowly dispersed, Sarah turned off the live stream and sat beside her mother. "How do you feel?" she asked. Eleanor exhaled slowly. "Like maybe I can finally stop hiding." Sarah smiled. "You were never hidden. You just forgot how to be seen." And for the first time in decades, Eleanor Whitman believed her. Eleanor sat upright in the hospital bed, staring at the thin envelope that had just been delivered by courier. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. The letterhead at the top read, "Franklin County District Court, Civil Case Review Division." She didn't need to read the rest. She already knew what it was about. The past was knocking. The unopened envelope she had kept for 38 years, the original insurance settlement, had sparked renewed legal attention. The viral news coverage, the GoFundMe campaign, and public records from the accident had reached the desk of a young investigative journalist in Columbus named Lena Hall, who had grown up hearing whispers about a teacher with the face that disappeared. What Lena found was more than a tragic car accident. She found a cover-up. It was the night of October 9th, 1987. Eleanor had just finished a late tutoring session at the school. She was driving home along a poorly lit stretch of Old Pine Road when a black pickup truck, speeding through a four-way stop sign, collided into the driver's side of her small sedan. The impact crushed the door and fractured her cheekbone, jaw, and orbital socket. The bleeding was internal at first. The swelling didn't go down. Weeks later, doctors discovered that abnormal tissue growth had started, aggressive, vascular, and inoperable. It grew slowly, year after year, erasing the woman she once saw in the mirror. Back then, the police report had cited no fault assigned. Eleanor, still in shock and deeply self-blaming, had refused to pursue charges. The man in the other vehicle, a 19-year-old named Ethan Granger, claimed she had swerved into the intersection. There were no witnesses. What Eleanor never knew, what the records now showed, was that Ethan had been drinking, not enough for a DUI conviction by 1987 standards, but enough that he should never have been behind the wheel. Worse yet, his father, Raymond Granger, had been the county's assistant district attorney at the time. The file Lena uncovered included suppressed witness statements and evidence that had never been submitted. A gas station attendant remembered Ethan stumbling into the passenger seat after buying beer. A sheriff's deputy later admitted off the record that they were told to let it go. Eleanor had been silenced by guilt and grief. The Grangers had been protected by power. Back in the hospital, Eleanor stared out the window, silent. The leaves had begun to fall faster now, drifting in slow spirals to the ground. Sarah sat across from her, watching her mother's face. "They want to reopen the case," Sarah said gently. "Lena's story is running this weekend. The DA is reviewing whether the original settlement was based on suppressed evidence." Eleanor didn't speak for a long time. Finally she said, "What would it even change?" Sarah stood, walking over to sit beside her. "Maybe nothing, maybe everything. Maybe it gives you a choice." "A choice? A choice not to carry this weight anymore," Sarah said. "A choice to say it wasn't your fault." Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes. For so long, she whispered, "I believed I deserved it. The face, the pain, the stares. I thought I'd done something wrong, that I hadn't been careful enough, that it was a punishment." Sarah took her hand. "It wasn't." Eleanor nodded slowly. "And what about him? Ethan? Is he still—" "He's alive," Sarah confirmed. "Still lives in Millfield, quiet life, runs a garage, never married." Lena tried to reach him. He didn't want to comment. There was silence. Then Eleanor said something no one expected. "I want to see him." The next morning, a hospital volunteer wheeled Eleanor, now dressed in a soft cardigan and scarf, into the back room of the hospital's private conference area. The lighting was warm, and a tea tray sat between two chairs. Ethan Granger stood there, his posture stiff, eyes downcast. He looked older, worn. Not guilty exactly, just tired. The years had been hard on him too, in their own way. Eleanor's voice was calm when she spoke. "You knew," she said. "You always knew it was your fault." Ethan nodded, not lifting his gaze. "I was a coward," he said hoarsely. "My dad, he made the calls, said it would ruin my future. I let him. I told myself it was just one mistake." She studied him for a long time. "You ruined my face," she said, her tone even, but firm. "You ruined the way I saw myself. You gave me a lifetime of silence, Ethan." His shoulders sagged under the weight of her words. "I've lived with the guilt every single day," he said. "I never married, never had kids. I thought it was my penance. But it never felt like enough." Eleanor leaned forward. "I don't need your guilt." That surprised him. He looked up finally, eyes bloodshot. "What do you want?" She considered the question. "I want you to tell the truth. Not for me, for the record. For all the people who carry shame that isn't theirs." He nodded again, slower this time. "I will." "And Ethan," she said softly as he stood to leave, "I forgive you. Not because you deserve it, but because I need to." Tears rolled down his cheeks, and for a moment there were no roles, no victim, no perpetrator. Just two people, older now, shaped by tragedy, standing in the quiet ruins of something neither could fix, but perhaps something they could finally bury. The auditorium was quiet, but it wasn't empty. Rows of children in neatly pressed clothes sat with their hands in their laps, fidgeting with excitement. Parents, teachers, community members, and media crews filled the space once again. But this time, the energy was different. This wasn't a debate. It was a homecoming. On stage, a single chair sat beneath a banner that read, "Welcome back, Mrs. Whitman. Thank you for teaching us how to see." Tommy Morrison sat in the front row, wearing a red bow tie that clashed wildly with his green jacket. He held a bouquet of sunflowers almost as big as his head. Every few seconds, he looked back toward the hallway doors with hopeful anticipation. The doors opened, and the room rose. Eleanor Whitman entered slowly, walking without assistance for the first time since her surgery. Her posture was straighter, her steps deliberate. Her face, still marked by healing scars, was no longer hidden. No makeup, no scarf, just her. She wore a soft gray dress and a silver necklace with a single pendant, a gift from her students years ago shaped like an open book. She reached the stage with Principal Janet Morrison at her side and took her seat. The applause lasted a full minute. Eleanor raised a hand gently, and the room fell silent. "I was never good with speeches," she began, her voice clear but warm. "That's why I became a teacher. I preferred listening and learning." A soft laugh rippled through the audience. "When I was a young woman, I believed that to be strong meant to be silent, to carry pain quietly, to not let anyone see the cracks. I thought if I could just be useful, maybe the world wouldn't mind how broken I felt. Her voice wavered just slightly, but I was wrong. She looked out across the crowd. You didn't turn away when you saw me. You turned toward me. You showed me something I never gave myself, Grace. She paused, eyes finding Tommy in the front row. And you, Tommy, you gave me back my courage. He blushed, beaming. This school, this town, this little corner of the world, it reminded me that healing doesn't always come from medicine. Sometimes it comes from being seen. From being loved when we believe we are unlovable. The auditorium was so quiet, you could hear the cameras clicking at the back. I may not be returning to the classroom full time, she continued, but I'm not going away. I've accepted the position as district mentor for new teachers, so I'll still be here, just a little taller now, thanks to all of you. More applause, a few sniffles, but before I go, she added, smiling, I'd like to read one last story. She reached into a bag beside her chair and pulled out a well-worn book, its spine taped, its cover creased, but its pages still whole. The Velveteen Rabbit. The room sighed. She opened the book, and for the next 10 minutes, Eleanor read the story of the rabbit who became real, not because he was perfect, but because he was loved. Her voice was gentle and expressive, just as it had been for decades. The children leaned in, the parents wept quietly, teachers smiled with aching eyes. When she reached the last line, and he was real, the boy had made him real with love. Eleanor closed the book softly. That, she said, looking up, is what you've done for me. She stood slowly as the crowd rose to their feet once more, not in applause this time, but in reverence. A small figure appeared at the edge of the stage, Tommy. He climbed the steps and held out the sunflowers, nearly tipping over from the weight of them. Eleanor laughed and knelt to take them. Will you still visit? He asked, eyes hopeful. Eleanor smiled. You couldn't keep me away if you tried. He leaned forward and hugged her. When she stood again, she looked out over the crowd one last time. I used to believe my story ended in silence, she said. Now I know it ends in song. And outside, the town square had been transformed. A mural was being painted along the side of the school, a large portrait of Eleanor, surrounded by children of all backgrounds, colors, and abilities. Across the top, bold letters read, Different isn't less. IT's just another way to shine. Eleanor walked past the mural, sunlight catching her silver hair. People stopped her on the sidewalk, not to gawk, but to thank her, to hug her, to say I love you. For the first time in her life, she didn't flinch when someone took her photo. For the first time, she saw herself the way they saw her, not as the woman with the tumor, not as the one who was hidden, but as a beacon, a teacher, a survivor, and finally, as someone who was real. Sometimes, the people who teach us the most aren't the loudest voices in the room. They're the ones who show up day after day, carrying silent battles with grace, reminding us that real beauty isn't what the world sees but what we dare to give despite it. And maybe, just maybe, being real doesn't come from being perfect. It comes from being loved anyway. Picture this, a woman standing in front of a classroom, not hiding, not apologizing, just smiling. Behind her, a wall filled with the drawings of children, each one saying in their own way, You made me feel seen. Now let me ask you something. Have you ever known someone like Eleanor, someone who changed your life quietly, without asking for anything in return? Tell us in the comments. We'd love to hear your story. And if this story touched your heart, even just a little, please like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you won't miss the next powerful story that just might change the way you see the world. Because the next Eleanor might be someone you walk past every day.